June 9th, 1865. A steam train tears through the Kent countryside. In a first-class carriage sits Charles Dickens, 50, famous, exhausted. Beside him, a young woman, 26, not his wife. The train approaches a viaduct near Staplehurst. Sections of track are missing. Workmen expected no train until evening, but the Folkestone train is early. At 3:13 p.m., the locomotive rounds the bend at 50 miles per hour. Too late. Carriages plunge into the dry riverbed. 10 die instantly. Dickens climbs from the wreckage, first thinking of the woman beside him, Ellen Ternan, and her mother, alive, shaken. Then he retrieves the blood-stained pages of Our Mutual Friend, the last novel he will ever finish. The newspapers call him a hero, but the real story isn't the crash. It's who he was with and why. Some secrets, even death, cannot unlock. Charles John Huffam Dickens was born on February 7, 1812, in Portsmouth, England. His father, John, worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, a respectable position that paid £80 a year. Enough to live on, not enough to live well. But John Dickens wanted to live well. He rented houses he couldn't afford. He bought furniture on credit. He entertained guests with wine and stories, playing the gentleman, while debt collectors circled like sharks. Charles was the second of 8 children. As a boy, he was small, sickly, prone to painful spasms in his side that left him bedridden for days. While other children played in the streets, Charles read. His father's library became his refuge. Robinson Crusoe, Tom Jones, the Arabian Nights. He memorized entire passages, acted out scenes for the family. At 8 years old, he wrote his first play, a tragedy about mistaken identity and death. Even then, he understood suffering. The family moved constantly, Portsmouth to London to Chatham, always one step ahead of creditors, always looking for a fresh start that never came. In Chatham, Charles was happy for a brief window. The family lived near the shipyards. Charles attended school, made friends, explored the countryside. He was bright, curious, hungry to learn. His teacher, William Giles, recognized something special in the boy and tutored him privately. John Dickens would point to Gad's Hill Place, a grand mansion on the road to Rochester, and tell young Charles, "If you work hard enough, you might live there someday." Charles believed him. Then everything collapsed. In 1822, the family moved to Camden Town, a grimy suburb in northwest London. No more countryside, no more private tutoring, just narrow streets, coal smoke, and the constant anxiety of unpaid bills. Charles was 10 years old. His education stopped. His older sister, Fanny, was accepted into the Royal Academy of Music on scholarship. She studied piano, voice, composition. She performed for royalty. Charles got nothing. He spent his days running errands, taking care of younger siblings, watching his sister disappear into a world he couldn't access. He felt abandoned, forgotten, like the world had decided his sister was worth investing in and he was not. His mother tried to open a school. She rented a house, printed advertisements, waited for students to arrive. No one came. The bills kept arriving. The creditors grew more insistent. John borrowed from everyone, friends, family, employers. He wrote desperate letters, made impossible promises. On February 20th, 1824, 13 days after Charles's 12th birthday, a man knocked on the door. John Dickens was arrested for debt and taken to Marshalsea Prison in Southwark. The debt was £40, about 6 months of his salary, the equivalent of being jailed today because you couldn't pay your credit card bill. Under the law, John could remain in prison indefinitely until the debt was paid. His family could live with him in the prison, many did, or survive on their own. Charles, at 12, became the man of the house. He walked the family's possessions to the pawn shop, one by one. The furniture, the china, his father's precious books, the volumes that had been his whole world. He watched them disappear behind the counter, got a few shillings in return. Then his mother made a decision that would haunt Charles for the rest of his life. She sent him to work.
Warren's blacking warehouse stood near Hungerford Stairs by the Thames, a rat-infested factory where boys placed lids on pots of shoe polish for 6 shillings a week. Charles worked 10-hour days alongside children in rags. Bob Fagan, Paul Green, others whose names he never recorded. Their hands were stained permanently black, their futures erased before they began. Charles's job was to cover the pots, paste on labels, tie them with string. Over and over, hundreds a day. His supervisor was a man named Bob Fagan, not the villain from Oliver Twist, but a real boy who showed Charles kindness when he was too sick to walk home. The work was mind-numbing, but the shame was worse. Charles had been raised to believe he was special, destined for something greater. Now he was just another child laborer, invisible to the world. He later wrote, "No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sank into this companionship and felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast." Every Sunday, he visited his father in Marshalsea. John lived in a small room with Charles's mother and siblings. Other families crowded the corridors. Debtors, criminals, the desperate poor, all trapped together. John held court like a king in exile. He gave advice to other prisoners. He wrote letters. He told Charles that something would turn up. Meanwhile, Fanny continued at the Royal Academy. She won a medal, performed at a concert Charles couldn't afford to attend. She was ascending. He was disappearing. The contrast was unbearable. At night, alone in his tiny rented room, Charles would cry himself to sleep. Then, unexpectedly, salvation arrived. John Dickens's mother died and left him £450, enough to pay his debts and secure his release. After 4 months in Marshalsea, John walked free. Charles assumed he would finally return to school, finally resume his real life. But his mother had other ideas. The family needed money. Charles was earning 6 shillings a week. Why waste that? She wanted him to stay at the factory. His father disagreed. For all John's faults, the spending, the lies, the broken promises, he pulled Charles out of Warren's. Charles never forgave his mother. Decades later, he wrote, "I never afterwards forgot, I never shall forget, I never can forget that my mother was warm for my being sent back." That betrayal, the sense that his own mother valued money over his future, shaped everything that came after. His novels are filled with terrible mothers, neglectful mothers, mothers who abandon their children or fail to protect them, and with good fathers who are broken by debt. Charles returned to school for 2 years, Wellington House Academy. The headmaster was a sadist who beat students regularly. Charles kept his head down, studied hard, tried to make up for lost time. But the money ran out again. At 15, he left school for good and became a law clerk at Ellis and Blackmore, a firm in Holborn. The work was tedious, copying documents, delivering papers, watching pompous lawyers spin words into fortunes. But he learned. He watched the legal system grind poor people into dust, watched families destroyed by endless litigation, watched the Chancery Court trap people in cases that lasted decades. He would later write Bleak House about exactly this. At 17, he taught himself shorthand, Isaac Pitman's system, one of the most complex ever devised. It took most people years to master. Charles learned it in months. By 18, he was working as a freelance court reporter. By 20, he was one of the fastest shorthand writers in London, covering criminal trials, parliamentary debates, political speeches. He worked 80-hour weeks, traveled across England following politicians, slept in coaching inns, ate cold meals, wrote until his hand cramped. But he was learning how the world worked, how laws were made, how power operated, how the rich protected themselves and the poor were left to suffer. And he was falling in love. Maria Beadnell, banker's daughter, beautiful, charming, completely out of his league. Charles met her in 1830 when he was 18. She was a year older, refined, educated, everything he wasn't. He courted her desperately for 3 years, wrote her letters, composed songs, imagined a future where he was worthy of her. Her parents disapproved. He wasn't successful, wasn't wealthy, wasn't good enough. Maria seemed to encourage him, then she didn't. She flirted with other men, kept him at a distance, let him hope without promising anything. On his 21st birthday, she made it clear she wasn't interested, never had been. The rejection devastated him. He threw himself into work, tried to forget, but he never fully recovered. Decades later, he would write about men who loved women who didn't love them back. Pip and Estella, David Copperfield and Dora, Arthur Clennan and Flora. Always the same story, always the same wound. But he kept writing. In December 1833, he submitted a short sketch to the monthly magazine. It was called A Dinner at Poplar Walk, a humorous piece about middle-class London life. The magazine published it, paid him nothing. Charles later noted that when he saw his words in print, he walked the streets of London at night, crying with joy and relief because someone had published his words, because he wasn't invisible anymore. He adopted the pen name Boz, a family nickname for his younger brother. More sketches followed, observations of London life, street vendors, taverns, courtrooms, prisons. He wrote about what he saw with humor and precision. In 1834, he got a job for the Morning Chronicle as a parliamentary reporter. The editor was George Hogarth, a Scottish writer and critic. By 1835, Dickens had enough material for a book. Sketches by Boz was published in February 1836. It sold well. Critics praised his eye for detail, his wit, his compassion. George Hogarth introduced him to his daughter, Catherine. She was 20, pretty, calm, steady, the opposite of Maria Beadnell, someone who wouldn't reject him. They married on April 2nd, 1836. Charles was 24. The first 2 installments of the Pickwick Papers were already in print. His life was about to change forever.
The posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club began as a commissioned work. A publisher named William Hall wanted illustrated stories about a sporting club. The artist, Robert Seymour, would provide the pictures. Dickens would provide the text. Dickens had other ideas. He rewrote the premise, making the characters more central than the sporting. After 2 installments, Seymour killed himself. Dickens brought in a new illustrator, Hablett Brown, Phiz, and kept writing. The first 2 issues sold poorly, 400 copies each. Then, in the 4th installment, Dickens introduced Sam Weller, a witty, street-smart servant who became Mr. Pickwick's companion. Sam Weller was a revelation, working class, clever, irreverent. He spoke in the language of the streets, but with sharp insight and humor. Sales exploded. By the end of 1836, Pickwick was selling 40,000 copies per monthly installment. Rich and poor alike read it. Pickwick clubs formed across England. People named their children after the characters. Dickens, 24 years old, was suddenly famous. The money poured in, £2,000 from Pickwick alone, more than his father had earned in 15 years. The family moved to a 3-story house at 48 Doughty Street in Bloomsbury.
Catherine's 17-year-old sister, Mary Hogarth, moved in to help with the children. Catherine had already given birth to their first child, Charles Jr., in January 1837. Dickens adored Mary. She was everything he had imagined in an ideal woman, kind, intelligent, supportive. She read his manuscripts aloud, laughed at his jokes, made the house feel like a home. While finishing Pickwick, Dickens started a second novel. Oliver Twist began serialization in Bentley's Miscellany in February 1837. For 10 months, he wrote 2 novels simultaneously, comedy and tragedy, laughter and horror, The Orphan Boy and The Gentleman's Club. No one had ever done this before. Then, on May 7, 1837, everything stopped. Dickens took Catherine and Mary to the theater. They saw a comedy. They laughed. When they returned home, Mary seemed happy, healthy, full of life. She went upstairs to bed. Minutes later, she collapsed. Dickens carried her to the sofa, held her, called for doctors. They came, said there was nothing to be done. A sudden illness, heart failure, some blockage they couldn't explain. Mary died in Dickens's arms the next afternoon. She was 17 years old. Dickens was destroyed. He cut a lock of her hair, took the ring from her finger and wore it for the rest of his life. He kept her clothes, dreamed of her constantly. He missed his deadlines for the first time in his career. Both Pickwick and Oliver were delayed. He wrote to a friend, "Thank God she died in my arms, and the very last words she whispered were of me." For months he couldn't work, couldn't function. He fantasized about being buried beside her when he died. Catherine, grieving her own sister, watched her husband mourn more deeply for Mary than he ever seemed to feel for her.
Eventually, Dickens returned to work. He finished Pickwick in triumph, started Oliver Twist, which became a sensation. Oliver Twist was unlike anything Victorian readers had seen. A novel about a boy born in a workhouse, sold into apprenticeship, lured into crime by Fagin and his gang of child thieves, rescued by kindness, but only barely. It was a brutal portrait of poverty, child labor, and the cruelty of institutions designed to help the poor, but that actually punished them. The workhouses were real. The conditions Dickens described, children starving, beaten, treated like criminals, were documented fact. But no one had written about them like this before, with this much anger, this much detail. The scene where Oliver asks for more gruel became iconic. The image of a starving child daring to ask for more captured the imagination of a generation. Queen Victoria called it excessively interesting. Critics debated whether it was appropriate to write about criminals and prostitutes, whether it glorified vice, whether it was art or propaganda. Dickens didn't care. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had survived. Oliver Twist was published in book form in 1838. It sold tens of thousands of copies. Dickens followed it with Nicholas Nickleby, another serial, another bestseller. The novel attacked abusive boarding schools in Yorkshire, where poor children were sent and often neglected or beaten. After publication, many of those schools were investigated and shut down. Dickens was learning that his words had power, that stories could change laws, that fiction could force people to see injustice they had been ignoring. Then came The Old Curiosity Shop, serialized in 1840-41. The story of Little Nell, a pure-hearted girl who wanders England with her grandfather, fleeing debt collectors, encountering villains and saints. It was sentimental, melodramatic. Victorian readers loved it. Each monthly installment sold 100,000 copies. People wept openly while reading. When the final chapters arrived, when Little Nell died, crowds gathered at the docks in New York, shouting to arriving ships from England, "Is Little Nell dead?" Irish politician Daniel O'Connell reportedly threw the book out a train window in grief. Dickens, not yet 30 years old, was the most famous writer in the English-speaking world. In January 1842, Dickens and Catherine sailed to America. It was his first transatlantic voyage. He was greeted like a rock star. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, everywhere he went, crowds gathered. Balls were held in his honor. He met Longfellow, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe. He shook hands with President John Tyler. But he also saw slavery, the brutality, the casual violence, the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated liberty while keeping millions in chains. He visited prisons, asylums, factories. He saw conditions as bad as anything in England. When he published American Notes later that year, he criticized American society harshly: the slavery, the spitting, the obsession with money, the lack of international copyright laws that let American publishers steal his work without paying him. American readers who had loved him turned on him instantly. Sales collapsed. He was called ungrateful, a traitor, a snob. Dickens learned a hard lesson. People love you when you entertain them. They hate you when you tell them the truth. By the mid-1840s, Dickens had written Martin Chuzzlewit, A Christmas Carol, The Chimes, Dombey and Son, and David Copperfield, the latter his most autobiographical novel. David Copperfield is Charles Dickens. Born into modest circumstances, father imprisoned for debt, sent to work in a factory, builds himself into a writer through sheer will. The novel was Dickens's attempt to process his childhood trauma without admitting it was real. He changed the details, made himself an orphan, gave himself a cruel stepfather instead of a neglectful mother. But the pain was real, the shame was real, the sense of abandonment was real. When friends praised the novel, Dickens deflected, said it was fiction, pure imagination. Only his closest friend, John Forster, knew the truth. By 1850, Dickens had everything: fame, wealth, a large house, 10 children. And he was deeply, quietly, desperately unhappy. His marriage was cold. Catherine was a good mother, but a distant wife. She was often pregnant, often exhausted, often depressed. They slept in separate rooms, spoke only about practical matters. Dickens felt trapped. He was 38 years old. He had spent his entire adult life working, building, achieving. And for what? A loveless marriage? A house full of children he barely knew? He threw himself into work, edited a weekly magazine, Household Words, wrote articles, performed in amateur theatricals, anything to avoid going home. He was restless, searching, waiting for something to break. In 1857, it did. In January 1857, Dickens decided to stage a play, The Frozen Deep, written by his friend Wilkie Collins, a melodrama about Arctic explorers and doomed love. Dickens loved acting. It gave him an outlet for the energy and emotion he couldn't express in daily life. He performed with manic intensity, throwing himself into roles with the same obsession he brought to writing. The first performances were private, held at Dickens's home for friends and family. Queen Victoria attended and loved it. Then Dickens decided to take the play public, staging it in Manchester to raise money for a friend's family. The amateur actresses couldn't perform in a public venue. It wasn't proper. So he hired professionals. Among them were the Ternan sisters, Maria, Fanny, and Ellen. Ellen Ternan was 18 years old, blonde, delicate, blue-eyed, intelligent, from a theatrical family that had seen better days. Charles Dickens was 45. He fell completely, obsessively, irreversibly in love. What happened next unfolded over months. Dickens began visiting the Ternan family. He sent gifts, offered to help with their finances. Ellen's mother was a widow, struggling to support her daughters. Dickens positioned himself as a benefactor, a friend, but he was more than that. By the fall of 1857, Dickens had decided his marriage was over. He told friends that Catherine had never understood him, that they had been incompatible from the start, that he had been unhappy for years. Some of this was true, but the timing was not a coincidence. In 1858, Dickens and Catherine separated, after 22 years of marriage, after 10 children.
Catherine moved in with her parents. Dickens kept the children and the house. Catherine's younger sister, Georgina, who had moved in after Mary's death and had helped raise the children, stayed with Dickens. People talked, rumors spread. Was Dickens sleeping with Georgina, with Ellen, with both? Dickens was furious at the gossip. In May 1858, he published a letter in the New York Tribune and other papers defending himself. He called Catherine mentally ill, said she had been a bad mother, claimed their marriage had been unhappy for years. He denied any improper relationship without naming Ellen. The letter was a disaster. Friends were horrified. Elizabeth Gaskell, a fellow novelist, cut ties with him. Others whispered that Dickens had lost his mind. But Dickens didn't care. He was in love. For the first time in decades, he felt alive. He set Ellen and her family up in a house in London. He visited constantly, paid for everything, her clothes, her rent, her mother's expenses. But London was too public, too many eyes, too many people who might recognize him. So in the early 1960s, he moved Ellen to France, first to Paris, then to smaller towns, Boulogne, Condé. He traveled to France constantly, sometimes monthly, sometimes more often. Between 1862 and 1865, he crossed the English Channel over 70 times. That's not normal. That's obsession. Historian Claire Tomlin spent years researching Ellen Ternan. She found hotel records, travel logs, financial documents, letters from Dickens' friends that hinted at secrets. Tomlin's conclusion: Ellen became pregnant in 1862. She gave birth to a son in early 1863 in France, away from prying eyes. The child died within months. There's no record of a burial, no record of a name, just silence. Dickens burned almost all of Ellen's letters in November 1860. He held a bonfire at Gad's Hill and destroyed decades of correspondence. He told friends he was protecting his family's privacy, but he was really protecting Ellen and himself. What was their relationship really like? Did Ellen love him, or did she feel trapped? She was 18 when they met. He was 45. He was famous, powerful, wealthy. She was from a struggling theatrical family. He offered security, stability, a future. Did she have a choice? Some historians argue Ellen was complicit, that she knew what she was doing, that she could have said no. Others point out the power imbalance, the lack of options for women, the fact that refusing Dickens might have meant poverty for her and her family. We'll never know. Ellen left no diaries, burned her letters. After Dickens died, she married and lived quietly. She never spoke publicly about him. The few people who knew her in later life said she seemed haunted, that she carried a sadness she couldn't explain. Meanwhile, Dickens kept writing. Bleak House, 1852-53, a savage attack on the legal system. The Court of Chancery traps people in lawsuits that last generations. Justice delayed is justice denied. Hard Times, 1854, a novel about industrialization, factories turning people into machines, utilitarianism crushing human emotion. Little Dorrit, 1855-57, about debt, prisons, families destroyed by financial systems they can't control. A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, the French Revolution, sacrifice, resurrection. The famous final line, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done." And Great Expectations, 1860-61. This was his most personal novel since David Copperfield. The story of Pip, an orphan who dreams of becoming a gentleman, who falls in love with Estella, a cold, beautiful girl raised to break men's hearts, who is ashamed of his origins, who gets everything he wanted and discovers it means nothing. Dickens poured his shame, his longing, his self-hatred into that book. Pip is Dickens. Estella is every woman who rejected him. The novel is about wanting to be someone you're not, about discovering that money and status don't heal old wounds, about realizing too late what you've lost.
By the early 1860s, Dickens was exhausted. He had written 14 major novels, edited 2 weekly magazines, published hundreds of articles, performed in plays, traveled constantly. He was also broke. Not actually broke, but supporting 3 households drains any fortune. His estranged wife, his children, his elderly mother, Ellen and her family in France, the house at Gad's Hill, the debts his sons were accumulating. So he went on tour. Public readings, his own work, performed live. Dickens had been doing small readings for years, charity events, private performances. But in 1858, he decided to go professional. He was electrifying on stage. He didn't just read, he performed. He acted out all the parts, changed his voice, his posture, his facial expressions. When he read the trial scene from Pickwick Papers, audiences howled with laughter. When he read the death of little Nell, women wept openly. He made £190 a night in London, sometimes more. He performed 50, 60, 70 times a year. The readings made him wealthy again, but they also destroyed him. Performing was physically brutal. The travel, the hotels, the constant pressure. Dickens was in his 50s. He had a weak heart. He suffered from gout, from kidney problems, from the lingering effects of the Staplehurst crash. But he couldn't stop. The readings gave him what writing couldn't: immediate feedback, applause, laughter, tears. He could see the effect of his words on people's faces. He was addicted to it. In 1867, at 55 years old, Dickens returned to America for a 4-month reading tour. He performed 76 times in cities across the East Coast. The winter was brutal. Snowstorms, freezing theaters. He caught a cold that never left. His foot swelled so badly he couldn't walk. Doctors gave him laudanum for the pain. He performed anyway. On February 7th, 1868, his 56th birthday, he met President Andrew Johnson at the White House. No record exists of what they discussed. He sailed home in April. He may have stopped in France to see Ellen before returning to England. He made £20,000 from the tour, about £2 million in today's money. It nearly killed him. By 1869, Dickens knew he was dying. His heart was failing. His left foot was numb. He had trouble breathing. He suffered from minor strokes that left him disoriented. Doctors begged him to stop performing, to rest, to slow down. He refused. Instead, he introduced a new reading, The Murder of Nancy by Bill Sykes from Oliver Twist. It was the most violent, visceral thing he had ever performed. Nancy, the prostitute with a good heart, beaten to death by her brutal lover. Dickens performed it with such intensity, such physical commitment, that doctors measured his pulse afterward and found it dangerously elevated. Women in the audience fainted. Men looked away. After each performance, Dickens stood paralyzed for several minutes, unable to move or speak, his body and mind overwhelmed. His manager, George Dolby, begged him to stop performing the scene. It was killing him. Dickens refused. He said the audience wanted it, that it was the most powerful thing he did. But really, he needed it. The violence, the release, the catharsis. In April 1869, he suffered a minor stroke in Chester. His left arm went numb, his speech slurred. He recovered, but the warning was clear. Doctors told him stop performing or die. He gave one more series of readings, then stopped for 3 months. Then he announced a farewell tour. In January 1870, Dickens gave his final series of public readings in London, 12 performances at St. James Hall. Tickets sold out in hours. On the final night, March 15, 1870, over 2,000 people packed the hall. He read from A Christmas Carol and the Pickwick Papers. The audience laughed, they cried, they gave him a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. At the end, Dickens stood alone on the stage. He looked at the crowd, the faces he had entertained, moved, challenged for decades. He said, "From these garish lights I vanish now forevermore." It was the last time he read in public. He returned to Gad's Hill Place, the mansion he had dreamed of as a boy, the one his father had pointed to and said, "If you work hard enough, you might live there someday." He had bought it years earlier. It should have felt like victory, like vindication. It didn't. The house was too big, too empty. Most of his children were grown and gone. Catherine lived elsewhere. Georgina ran the household, but they were not companions. Ellen visited occasionally, but their relationship was strained, secret, suffocated with lies. He was alone in the house he had always wanted, and he was dying. On June 8, 1870, Dickens spent the day working on his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, a murder mystery set in a cathedral town. A young man disappears. Was he murdered? By whom? Dickens had planned 24 chapters. He completed 6. That evening, he sat down to dinner with Georgina. He complained of feeling unwell. His face was flushed. His speech was confused. He grasped for words that wouldn't come. Georgina suggested he lie down. He said, "Yes, on the ground." He collapsed. Doctors came. Brain hemorrhage, massive. Nothing to be done. For 24 hours, Dickens lay unconscious on a sofa in the dining room where he had collapsed. Georgina sat beside him. His children were summoned. Ellen Ternan came, secretly, through the back entrance. She sat with him, held his hand. Then she left before the others arrived, before anyone could see. At 6:10 p.m. on June 9, 1870, exactly 5 years to the hour of the Staplehurst crash, Charles Dickens died. He was 58 years old.
Charles Dickens wanted a simple funeral. He had specified it in his will. No public announcement, no procession, no monument. He wanted to be buried in a small churchyard near Rochester Cathedral, close to Gad's Hill. That's not what happened. Dean Arthur Stanley of Westminster Abbey insisted. Charles Dickens, the voice of Victorian England, belonged among the greatest writers in English history. He belonged in Poets' Corner, alongside Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare. On June 14, 1870, Dickens was buried at Westminster Abbey. The funeral was private, as he had requested. Only 12 people attended the actual burial, but the grave was left open for 2 days so the public could pay respects. Thousands came. They filed past in silence. They left flowers. They wept. Working-class people, the poor, the ones Dickens had written about his entire life. They came to say goodbye to the man who had seen them, who had told their stories, who had insisted they mattered. The mystery of Edwin Drood was never finished. We'll never know who killed Edwin, or if Edwin was even dead. The final pages Dickens wrote remain ambiguous, haunting, incomplete, like his life. Ellen Ternan inherited £1,000 in Dickens's will, described only as Ellen Lawless Ternan of Ampthill Square. No explanation, no public acknowledgement. She married a schoolmaster named George Wharton Robinson in 1876. She was 37, he was younger. She never told him about Dickens, or if she did, he never spoke of it. She had 2 children, lived quietly. When she died in 1914, her death certificate listed her age incorrectly, shaving years off to hide her connection to Dickens. She took the secrets to her grave. Catherine Dickens outlived Charles by 9 years. She kept every letter he had ever written to her. She told people, "I loved him better than any woman in the world." When she died in 1879, she left those letters to the British Museum with instructions that they be made public. She wanted the world to know, once he had loved her. So, what's the legacy? Charles Dickens gave the world Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, Bleak House. He invented characters that have outlived him by 150 years. Scrooge, Fagin, Miss Havisham, the Artful Dodger. He changed Christmas. Before A Christmas Carol, Christmas was a minor religious holiday. After Dickens, it became what we know today, a season of generosity, family, redemption. He influenced social reform. After Oliver Twist, people paid attention to workhouses. After Nicholas Nickleby, abusive schools were investigated. His novels were evidence, testimony, indictments. He showed that fiction could change laws, that stories mattered. But he also showed that good people do terrible things, that you can write about compassion while failing to show it in your own life, that genius doesn't excuse cruelty.